Hello and welcome. This is the Mutiny Investing Podcast. This podcast features long-form conversations on topics relating to investing, markets, risk, volatility, and complex systems.
All right, Jared Dillian, plug away right at the top. Where can people find you? Where do they locate you? Where do they go to buy as many copies as possible of this book?
So the book that we're going to be talking about today is called Those Bastards, 69 Essays on Life, Creativity, and Meaning. And the book is on Amazon. You can get a paperback or a Kindle. There is going to be an audiobook. We're in the process of recording it right now. So in about a month or two, there should be an audiobook. So if you like audiobooks, you can wait for that. But otherwise, there's paperback and Kindle.
And then where do people find you on Twitter, Daily Dirtnap, all that good stuff?
Twitter, I'm at Daily Dirtnap. You can just look up Jared Dillian. I got about 72,000 followers at this point. The newsletter, my financial newsletter, which is basically my day job, is the Daily Dirtnap, which you can find at dailydirtnap.com. And you can subscribe to that if you want. It's pretty good. So
I can corroborate that. As you know, I'm a subscriber, and as you know, I bought the book as well. Unfortunately, I didn't buy 10 copies like you suggest everybody that does. How do you like the Tim Ferriss of the world? They're really good at that. Did you think about like structuring, like buy a dozen copies, you get such and such gift? If you buy 100 copies for like your firm, you'll get a one-on-one with me. Like, did you think about trying to like gamify all of that aspect of like selling books in bulk?
So I didn't, but for the next book, I probably will. And the next book comes out in January of next year. So I'm going to be that one. I really have a chance of making the bestseller list. And by the way, if you make the bestseller list, even for 1 week, it's awesome because for the rest of your life, you get to say that you're a New York Times bestselling author.
That's the point. I think everybody kind of shits on the authors that try to gamify that and like they buy like thousands of copies of their own book. But I'm like, if the system's set up that way for you to be a New York Times bestselling author, and most people use it to go on speaking tours, right, and up their stage fees. Like I understand why people do it, but I could never see you really going down that route.
I have not yet begun to defile myself.
Man, that was a great tweet the other day. I saw that one from you. That was one of your perfect wordsmithing. I knew you were proud of that one too. I read it. I was like, damn, that's good. And I bet he was proud of that one. We were kind of talking before we got online about like, how do you get on those bestseller lists and how kind of antiquated that idea is with physical bookstores. But I think actually it was one of my buddies, John Katsmita, that actually tweeted at you about when's the audio coming out. But talk a little bit about that process because you're spending money and doing the audiobook in the right way. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So a lot of people, look, like I used to be on radio, so I have a pretty good voice for doing this. And a lot of people wanted me to record the audiobook. And I'm like, fuck that. Absolutely not. So tedious, so time consuming. Like I hate reading stuff. I like talking, but I hate reading because there's a lot of pressure to get it right. And if you flub something and you got to start over, it just sucks. Like I really did not want to record the audiobook. So the guy I got to do it, his name is LJ Ganser. And he's actually, I think he's a stand-up comedian, but he did the audiobook for Street Freak and everybody loved it. So he's my personal audiobook guy now. So I got him to do Those Bastards. I'm having him do the next book. Like he's terrific.
And do you mind like talking about like kind of what the production costs are you for like audio side, book side? Like I think it'd be insightful for people. Anybody that's interested in finance is usually interested in business and the actual metrics. But if you don't want to talk about it, that's completely
No, I can talk about that. So if you want to hire somebody to record an audiobook, it's generally between $200 and $400 an hour. And the number of hours depends on the number of words in the book. So this was 100,000 words, so 10 hours. So it ended up being $4,000. He charged $400 an hour, so he was on the high end. So it's costing me $4,000.
I think last time you and I were in person down in Cayman, we talked a little bit about this, but it's interesting to me of where that inflection point is for like self-publishing versus a publishing house. Is, people always think they want a publishing house, but then they realize the publishing house normally doesn't do anything for you, right? Even like your cover art, your marketing, your branding, everything's really up to you. And you're just like recouping that advance. But how do you think, like, what's that shift like? Do you obviously still prefer using a publishing house? What do you think the advantages still are in this marketplace?
Well, really, it's about distribution. It's about being able to get books in stores. So for those bastards, I have no distribution. It lives on Amazon and it doesn't live anywhere else. If you wanted to go buy it in an airport, you can't. So, with the publishing house, you get distribution and they're competing for shelf space. And, still a lot of books are sold in stores. And if you have a book out on the front table, it's a new hardcover, it's got a cool cover, people will pick it up sight unseen. So you get a lot of sales that way.
And do you think part of that, like I'm in the Philly area right now, is like there's actually, I've seen a few Barnes and Noble here. Do you think it's more like the coastal elites don't realize there's still like Barnes and Nobles and bookstores in the rest of the country? Because then maybe they're questioning that.
There's one in Myrtle Beach. There's a Barnes and Noble here. Yeah.
By the way, when you hear coastal elites, technically you're on the coast, but I don't think you qualify or count yourself as one of the coastal elites.
I mean, Devin and I had dinner at a place called Between the Antlers. If that answers your question at all. So
I think he did tell me about that dinner. So there was there's several essays in the book, and then also it probably is going to mix in with some of the stuff from Daily Dirtnap. But I had a few questions for you. One I'll start with is I grew up in rural Michigan, and when I originally went to college at Charleston in South Carolina, one of the things I did as a teenager is I started working in fine dining. And I felt like that was a civilizing and worldly effect for me. Like I learned about, fine dining from around the world, how to eat, how to drink wine, how to pair food and wine. So it was really an educational process for me. But one of the things you point out in the book is that you think that finance makes you worldly. So like, tell me why you think that.
Yeah, I mean, let me see how I can phrase this. Think about the average person. Think about the person who's a fourth grade teacher, right? And what does their life consist of? Their life consists of managing kids and giving homework assignments. And, they might come home and they might watch the evening news for half an hour, but they're really not that exposed to current events. They don't really know what's going on in the world. They don't have a clear picture. Somebody who is a trader is plugged into news on a second by second basis. They have to understand the political situation and monetary policy in a whole bunch of different countries. I mean, think of somebody who's like a Latin American FX trader, right? And the things they have to understand about Brazil and Mexico and politics and monetary policy and stuff like that. It really does make you worldly. And I think the quote I use in the book is that if you take some kid from Staten Island and you put him on a trading desk, within a few years, they're going to be able to have an intelligent conversation with most world leaders, and I think that's absolutely true.
And do you think that's primarily at the global macro level? And how do you think that education works? Do you think like when you're getting started, it's like you almost feel like you're cramming for a final like every week and you're really getting up to speed on like the global macro landscape? And were you using, books, newspapers back then? Like, how do you really get up to speed, especially with what you're trading?
That's a good question. I mean, for me, in 2001, when I started working at Lehman Brothers, I was reading the Wall Street Journal, the newspaper, the actual newspaper, on the bus on the way to work. And I would try to read the entire paper. And then I would get in and, I would log on to Bloomberg, and Bloomberg would have news, and I would read Bloomberg news. So that's really where I got most of my current events. I mean, nowadays, there's so many more sources. I mean, just being on Twitter, it's like drinking from a fire hose with all this stuff. So,
yeah, I was thinking about that this morning actually with you. Is like, how much did it move away from, reading New York Times, Financial Times, whatever you get your hands on, versus now? Do you think that like 90% of your consumption comes from just like the sentiment on Twitter, or like in that, but through Twitter though, you can find all those papers and newspaper articles as well. But like, is that how you think about it?
Yeah, pretty much. And I would say the other 10% is just talking to people. Talking to average people, talking to my hairstylist, talking to a real estate appraiser, talking to teachers, asking them how they feel about the economy. So that's the other 10%. And that 10% is really important. It was funny because I do a spot on the radio station, the local radio station here, every Thursday morning. And last week I went in and they were convinced that the dollar was going to lose its reserve currency status. You know what I mean? So it had trickled down to Myrtle Beach, where the local radio hosts were talking about this. So that's when I said, okay, this has pretty much come to an end. So
well, I want to get back to that US dollar dethroning a little bit later as well. But I think about the dichotomy of that too. I actually get a lot of sentiment from my dad. He sells large CNC machines. So basically the tools that make the tools. And so it's always interesting to see how like his sales are going in the Midwest, like where people are always like saying, you know, the death of American manufacturing, but at like that high-end precision manufacturing, we're competing with Germany and we're still slightly ahead. So people don't realize that. So like you're saying, getting like that local knowledge. But at the same time, you know, I was thinking about when I was here in this area going like the Texas Roadhouse the other night, like nobody was talking about Chat GPT-4 or any of those things. So it's like a little bit of both. It's nice respite from our world, but at the same time, you get a real world feedback that people in the local community are not thinking about the things that we're arguing about.
Yeah.
And so, like, do you feel like, I think to me, it's a breath of fresh air when I come here to this area, because then I'm not in that kind of feedback loop and that echo chamber. And like, do you think that gives you just a different perspective living in that Myrtle Beach area?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. You know, it was the best thing in the world for me to move out of New York, you know, because I started the newsletter in 2008 and I ran it for about a year and a half, a little more in New York. And I was plugged into that whole ecosystem, you know, the fleece vest, everybody thinks alike, everybody has the same ideas. You know, it wasn't fleece vest back then, but
Right.
But you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I've ever asked you, how did you end up on the South Carolina coast? Like, why did you move down there?
Because my wife became a professor at Coastal Carolina.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a beautiful place, by the way. Coastal Carolina is a beautiful school.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about like the education you get and it makes you more worldly to like work in finance or be a trader, I think it really helps on that global macro sense and getting an idea how the world works in a global sense. But how do you think about, to me, it's a dichotomy between the micro sense. Is I find like a lot of people that work in finance that have never really run a business or run a company have no idea what they're talking about when they start talking about like individual stocks or anything, because they don't understand the decision making or opacity of what it's like to actually run a business and how hard that is.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, you know, here's another thing about traders. You know, the funny thing about trading is that it doesn't give you any transferable skills really to anything else. You know what I mean? So it's actually tough because, you know, people will be a trader until they're 45 and then they lose their jobs and then they're stuck because what do? Well, you know, at their essence, like traders are really business people. They have a P&L, they're running a business. You know, when I ran the ETF desk at Lehman, I had revenues, I had expenses. Like it was like running a business. So traders are really, they're positioned to be entrepreneurs once they leave Wall Street. Like the most successful of them go and start their own businesses. I think that's really like the best career path for somebody on Wall Street.
It's interesting. I actually think of more like entrepreneurs in a way, and like I think a lot of them when they leave the bank, they don't realize the actual ecosystem they're under and the P&L of the bank and all of their you know the data information they're getting that all the banks providing. I think when some of them step out on their own, they don't realize how difficult the outside world is outside the confines of the bank a lot of times.
Well, that's true because, you know, you do have revenues and expenses, but in general, you spend 99% of your time trying to make the revenues go up and you spend 1% of your time thinking about the expenses. So, yeah.
And you spend 0% of your time on sales, which when they get out in the world is like 90% of your time spent on sales. And so that's always the difficult part. You know, one of the first essays you had, I keep thinking about this idea Schopenhauer had. And the idea Schopenhauer had is like, he said, for every generation you live, it's like you're selling tickets to the Conjurer show, meaning like the magic show, right? And so if you've seen the magic show, you've seen all the tricks, you know how it works, but every successive generation that comes along, it's like you're seeing the eternal recurrence again. So like I always think about it as like, you know, when we were growing up, like you had Madonna was like breaking all the taboos and like, everybody's like, oh my God, like Madonna. And then like the next, you have Britney Spears come along. Now you have like Miley Cyrus and then whoever the next person is. But it's like, we just keep seeing kind of like the same things over and over. But one of the ones I don't think people see is the idea with like marijuana, which was like one of your first essays, right? And I thought you had a fairly contrarian stance on that. But like one of the things I always bring up is like people don't realize in the 70s, we passed, I think through 12 to 15 states passed like legal marijuana laws, and then everything got rescinded. And like, as you brought up, is like when we were kids, like I got scared to death through DARE and all these other things. And I think was it Lynn Bias that died on the court from cocaine?
Yes,
That one
yes.
scared the shit out of me as
1984.
as a soccer player with heart issues and everything. Like I was so scared of drugs, but like to use your essay is kind of like how we flipped into this idea like that, like marijuana is like a almost like snake oil, like it heals everything. So like how do you think about those dichotomies from the historic perspectives and how they change over time?
Yeah, and it'll change again. 15, 20 years from now, maybe sooner, we'll go back to where we were in the 80s. There will be a backlash against all this drug use. I mean, I think that is coming. Like it goes in waves. I think marijuana is absolutely a gateway drug. I think people try that first and then they move on to other stuff. And sometimes it just, leads them to a dark place. But like, as you said, like now it's considered to be a miracle drug. It cures everything, and like I said, it like the cycle will come around and, 10, 15 years from now, it'll go back the other way.
But how do you like, I guess some of the more proselytizers, I always think about like, I know you're really open to the variance among, mental personalities and everything, like Joe Rogan of the world, right? Who's somebody that's like on, 100 miles per hour every second of the day. And he thinks like marijuana like kind of regulates him a little bit. Like it's understandable for somebody like him, but like other people, it just means you're smoking couch weed and you're not getting off the couch. And I think that's maybe more what you're talking about.
Well, I think we all know somebody who smokes a little bit too much marijuana.
Yeah.
And what do we call that person? We call that person a stoner. You know what I mean? So it's not an addictive drug in the physical sense, but it's habit forming. I think there's a difference between those two things. I think it's habit forming. And I think it can be used as a psychological crutch for people. So,
and I think about in your essays, I think you call it like the heads, right? Like the metal heads, whatever we used to call it back in the day. But like part of it I always wonder is about the taboos, right? Like drugs were incredibly taboo when we were kids, which also makes it incredibly exciting to use drugs. Like, how do you think about if we remove taboos, like, does it make it more normalized and the youth don't want to rebel as much, based on those taboos?
Well, they just rebel in different ways. You know what I mean? So however that may be, but they just rebel in different ways. But the thing I said about the heads was, I grew up, I went to high school from 1988 to 1992. And this was during that whole wave of like hair metal and jean jackets and patches on the jackets. But we actually had smoking areas at our high school. The students could actually smoke in between classes. And it was full of all these heads. We called them heads. Yeah. And, what I said in the essay was, what did these people go on to do with their lives? Like absolutely nothing. The whole thing that people were saying at the time that if you did marijuana, you would drop out of society and you would be working in a chop shop. Like it absolutely happened. It turned out exactly that way. So I was one of the good kids in high school. I never did drugs in high school. And, it's where I turned out. So.
Well, but it makes me think about too, because I don't know why I think about this often as well, is like how society flips, like high school dynamics versus real world, right? Like you're saying, if you're one of the good kids, you study hard, you're made fun of in high school, but then you end up succeeding in life. And whether it was people being able to smoke between classes, which, as you know, is crazy these days to even think about, is I always think it's like, for lack of a better term, like townies or local people, right? Like if you're a local sports star in high school and everything, is like, the idea is most of those guys were cool and got all the girls. And then after high school, one, they probably didn't go to college. And then two, they're like maybe selling cars at a local car dealership. And it's like, it's a flip dynamic of life. And that's hard for people to deal with at a young age.
Well, actually, I remember that was another one of my essays. It was called Never Peak Early.
Yeah. It's hard to do, right? Like you, as a kid, you want to be cool, as a teenager. It's hard to deal with. But at the same time, I know you're empathetic or sympathetic. I can never get those two words right, and you're the writer, so you can help me with that. But like, I also don't think you necessarily look down on the people that just stay in their hometown and like work at a garage or something too.
No, not necessarily. No.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I remember I went to a high school reunion. It was either the 5-year reunion or the 10-year reunion. I can't remember which. But the high school quarterback, who was like a stud in high school, he comes up to me, big grin on his face. I'm like, hey, what are you up to? He's like, I started my own landscaping business. I'm like, that's fucking awesome. That's terrific. You're probably doing really well. I'm happy for you, so it's just a different path,
I think what was interesting to me too is like a lot of the essays are kind of, it's life advice, but not life advice. Obviously, like you're just telling about your life and what works for you. But one of the ones I think that most people should really glom onto that most people don't is one of the things you talked about was writing down your fears. So can you kind of like flesh that out a little bit more and tell the audience a little bit about that? Because I thought that was one of the most interesting pieces I read.
So this was from The Cure for Anxiety. Yep. And I'm a little bit of a neurotic person. Actually, never mind a little bit. I'm a very neurotic person. And I tend to, I'm obsessive. I have obsessive thoughts. I think about things obsessively. And sometimes I'll have a fear that something bad is going to happen. I'm going to lose something that I have, or I'm not going to get something that I want. And it becomes this fear that I obsess about. And then it just takes over everything. And I can't get rid of it. So what I do in that situation is I write it down. I go onto my phone in the notes section and I write it down. And I do this every time I have a fear that I'm obsessing about. I write it down on this list. And what happens is that after about 6 months, I look at the top of the list at the things I had fear about 6 months ago, and it turned out to be nothing, And I'm like, well, why was I afraid about that? And then you start to learn that everything that you have fear about turns out to be nothing. So that's what I do. That's sort of a trick that I do to get through this. So,
well, there's a couple other parts to that. One is I think you said in the essay, nobody ends up taking your advice on that. By the way, I went right into my notes app after reading that and created a fears thing. I haven't put anything in there yet, which I got to get better at, but at least it's in my notes app for it now, at least. But part of it too is like what I think Tim Ferriss used to talk about. Stakes are important. Is you bet your wife based on those fears, though, don't you?
I bet my what?
You bet your wife like about those fears coming to fruition.
Yeah. So let's say I'll have some compliance related issue at work, and I think I'm going to get in trouble. I think the SEC is going to come after me or something like that. I'll come home and I'll say to my wife, I'm like, I'm definitely going to jail. And she's like, you're not going to jail. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I'm going to jail. She says, I will bet you $1,000 that you are not going to jail. So we set a time, like 3 months, 6 months, whatever, and we write it down in the calendar. And then after 6 months, if I'm not in jail, I have to pay her $1,000. And I've paid her over the years. I paid her like $40,000 on like one thing was $10,000. I bet her $10,000 on something. And it's just, but after you write all these checks, you start to learn. You're like, all right, this is stupid. Like, she's going to take money from me again. Like, this is not happening. So,
but there's nothing like those stakes of money and having to fork it over. And what I love is that she holds you to it, but also like not to get into her personal side, but like, is there something she likes blowing money on that she uses it for? Because that would be even more enjoyable, I think.
I tell her, when I pay her the money, I'm like, look, go buy yourself something nice. And she says, no, I'm just saving it. So and she just saves it.
Nice. So like you said, you have, if nobody's read Street Freak, I highly recommend they go out and read it. It was really enjoyable. One of the, I just ripped through it. So actually I didn't necessarily rip through it because I told you, it was like, I almost had to pause and set it down after each chapter because it was so intense, which is very rare for me. Like I can really, plow through books in a methodical pace, but it was really interesting to me because of the intensity of the way you wrote about it and how vivid a lot of that stuff was. It took me a while to get through. So part of it's like you're saying is like these obsessive things about worrying about catastrophizing what could potentially happen and betting your wife. The other one though, that kind of is shocking to me reading Those Bastards is if you read Street Freak most of Street Freak is about you losing your fucking shit and just smashing things to bits, yelling and swearing at everybody on the trading desk. And then most of Those Bastards is about how calm you are now. Like that's almost like people losing like 200 pounds and then not having recidivism and keeping it off. Like how the fuck did you do that?
Lot of work. Yeah. No, really, that's all I can say. That's all I can say. Just a lot of work.
Well, like part of that work, I think almost like writing down your fears. I think one of them, like you said it about like yelling, like you used to be a big time yeller. And what I resonated with is like, I grew up in a family of yellers. I grew up with extended family of yellers. I remember when I was in my 20s, I probably yelled a lot too. And eventually I think we learned that as we get older. And what I always wonder is like, do we get wiser? Or do you think we just lose testosterone? Like, do we really get that much better, or is we're just losing the hormones that make us as angry as we are when we're in our 20s?
I think it's both. But the funny thing is that there's actually another element to this, which you probably haven't considered. If you go back and watch a movie from the 80s, there's lots of yelling. Like, I can't name one, like Kramer versus Kramer or something like that. Like, there's a lot of yelling. Movies today, nobody yells. Even like the villains in the movies are very calm, very measured. Like, nobody yells in movies. So in addition to, us sort of getting better over time, like, I think there's a cultural element where it's become culturally not acceptable to yell in public or even private situations.
But how much do you think? I thought about that too, and to me, that tied into also the essay on marijuana, like how you think about like the cycles we go through. But I think about the British philosopher John Gray always talks about we're waxing and waning, or we oscillate between liberalism and barbarism. And to me, it's like, are we actually getting more civilized and are we getting better? Or could this go away instantly and in the next decade we'll be back to yelling at each other? Like, how do you think about that?
No, I think civilization only goes in one direction. I think we become more civilized over time. I actually don't think it goes in waves. And I think there's maybe in certain subsectors we do or we don't, but like overall civilization runs in one direction. So,
or like, I guess maybe a way of thinking about that is like different time horizons or cycles, right? Maybe over a multi-decade period we might go in waves, but you think over the centuries and millennia, like we're generally heading more in a civilized pattern.
Yeah,
because like you could see how like a lot of liberal values or whatever that seem to be in concrete over the last few decades are starting to get overturned, but you think those are just part of the smaller waves over shorter time horizons?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
One of the things, by the way, speaking of liberals, is like you had a great essay on what was the title was something like "My friends are all liberals."
I hate liberals, but all my friends are liberal. Yeah.
So tell me, I find myself to be like politically agnostic. So like kind of flesh that out for me a little bit, is like why you hate liberals, but all your friends are liberals.
Well, so I'm a very artistic person. I mean, I'm getting a degree in fine arts, right? And I liked really highbrow underground music. I like really highbrow art. I like music. I like culture. I like all these things. But like economically speaking, I'm very conservative. I'm probably one of the biggest fiscal conservatives that you'll ever run into. I'm really like an Austrian when it comes to economics. You know what I mean? So I find myself in these situations where if I'm hanging out with conservatives, I agree with them on economics, but we have nothing in common in terms of culture, right? They listen to the Allman Brothers, Leonard Skinner, and stuff like that. But if I'm hanging out with liberals, like we have nothing in common in terms of economics, but I agree with them in terms of culture. And what I talked about in the essay was this idea of an openness score from the Big Five personality test, and how liberals generally have a much higher openness score. They're open to new things. Where was I going with this? I forgot.
Liberals are more open to new things, and I think part of it is that Republicans are more conservative. Or
the big takeaway in that essay, I talked about tradition and beauty, right? And I talked about how tradition is downstream of beauty. So when something's new, like let's say Nirvana, like in 1990, Nirvana is scary because it's new, it's different, and liberals are attracted to that, but conservatives recoil from it. But then 30 years later, Nirvana is playing on easy listening stations. You know what I mean? Because now it's tradition. It's not new anymore. It's not scary. So it becomes part of tradition. So I said that tradition is downstream of beauty, and that liberals are attracted to beauty and beautiful things. So that's why I tend to hang out with liberals more, even though I disagree with them on economics.
Yeah, I think you even ended that essay of like, as you and I know when we were growing up, is like I was really into gangster rap when I was like in elementary and middle school, and like we had the whole Tipper Gore censorship thing on our CDs and cassettes. But like you said, now like those that's played at weddings, like like that is crazy to think about. I did notice there's so many things in there I kind of want to pull on because did I notice a pattern for me in your essays is like what ostensibly the topic is about, like liberals versus conservative in this, actually turned out a thing about openness versus tradition. So to me, there's been like almost like a turn. There's like an essay within an essay. It's like you start off on one essay and then in the middle, it's actually about something else. And then you tie it back in on the end. Is that like fair? Like, am I overarching on that or over?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it feels like I said, it was about liberals and conservatives, but it's actually about openness and tradition.
Yeah.
And that's what, and by the way, this is the highest compliment I can give is I actually read that part of the essay to my girlfriend this morning because I thought it was so interesting talking about openness and tradition and, you know, being around her in-laws and just, and showing how what today's openness now, like you're saying in 20 years is going to be the next tradition. Right. And like how that changes, but it helps you see people differently. Like the way I think about it often is like, people aren't going to agree with me. Like I have a different mind. I'm very like you. I'm very artistic. I'm very open. And so when people don't understand the way I think and they work from a traditional mindset, like you have to be open to that, right? Like that they just think differently. And so you're not really talking about the same conversation. You're having two very different conversations most of the time.
Yeah.
So that was the one I thought was a really interesting kind of spin on that, like openness versus tradition. I was trying to think about but how does that, so if we had a tradition of yelling, now we're getting to a more openness culture. But part of, you know, realizing, you know, are people coming from an openness perspective or are they coming from a traditional perspective? Is part of that is taking a beat to think about it, to see the other person's opinion, like perspective. But part of your yelling thing is like you had like a 3-part system you use now for yelling and why you don't yell anymore or why you haven't yelled in over a decade. And it's like, does something need to be said? Does something need to be said? Does something need to be said right now? And does something need to be said right now by me? Did I get that right?
Almost. Yeah. Close enough. Yeah.
Say how you'd say, like, what did I get off?
Does something need to be said? Does something need to be said by me? Does something need to be said by me right now? Yeah.
But how do you find that beat though? To like, because like if I go back to your trading days, right, you wouldn't have had that split second to think through those 3 questions. You would have just went all out rage. So like, how do you find the space to get to that point?
You have to pause. And I didn't write an essay about that. I probably should at some point in the future. But one of the things I do nowadays is when I'm faced with something that's provocative, usually it's an email. You know, if somebody sends me an email that's provocative, my instinct is to answer it right away, you know, to answer it immediately and respond. And nowadays I pause, I wait, I'll put it away for 24 hours. I'll get a good night's sleep and I'll look at it the next day and then I will respond. Or maybe I won't respond at all, but I always pause first. So.
And then after you respond, do you also pause on the response for like 24 hours too? Sometimes like there's 2 ways of doing that.
What do you mean?
Like, so like, for example, if I respond right away, I at least won't hit send, right? It'll sit in my drafts for 24 hours. So it's kind of the same thing. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So ideally in a world, I would file it away, not respond for 24 hours, then respond, but file it away in drafts and then look at it again. And then most likely I'd never send emails back, right? Isn't that the kind of just, that's all of it. So I'm, you know, one of the things I struggle with, or I think about all the time and I bring up with amongst friends is like you're saying this culture of yelling that we grew up with. And then you're talking about what you feel is openness as an artist, right? Like I feel in general, like I'm a pretty sensitive artist type. A lot of people think I'm pretty curmudgeon on the outside and all that stuff, but I'm actually deeply like a sensitive artist at base nature. But in our culture, the way we grew up in like Gen X, like that was totally anathema to that culture. And I think about it now, like if we come into a group of Gen X guys and we're just like meeting up, like especially finance guys, right? All we're going to do is start ribbing each other right away because we can't express emotions. So I'm just curious, like how you handle those differences kind of in everyday life of like being an open, sensitive artist, but then coming from a generational culture that was very not showing emotions, very reticent to even, you know, express anything.
You know, it's funny. I cry a lot. a lot, actually. And I was sitting on the couch with my wife the other day, and she doesn't cry very much, hardly ever. But I cry at the TV. Okay, so like American Idol was on, and the contestants got eliminated, and I'm like crying on the couch, and she starts making fun of me, and then she said she always makes fun of me for that, and then she said something interesting. She's like, I really shouldn't make fun of you for that because I'm very happy that you have empathy. You know what I mean? And so that's a part of my personality that she likes, because I have a great deal of empathy. So, but when I'm just, I don't know if you felt this way when you first met me, but I don't really have a lot in the way of facial expressions. I have this very, I'm very stone faced. Like I don't really smile or make any facial expressions. And a lot of people think of me as just this sort of unemotional person, but the opposite is actually true. I'm actually incredibly emotional. I just don't show it. And I don't show it because of the way I was conditioned growing up and being in the military and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I think part of it, actually, I was telling our mutual friend, Devin Anderson, the other day. I don't know if you remember this. I think the first time I met you in person, we were at an event in San Diego and we were in a green room and everybody on the panel, we were all kind of chit chatting and you were just sitting there in the corner, like on your phone, stone face. And I was just like, all right, he's kind of a dick. All right. He's a little bit dickish. All right. But that doesn't really bother me. So then when you got on stage, you were more animated. But then I was thankful that when we got to spend time together and came in, I started to see all of that and kind of see your personality quirks. And then once I realized that's the way you are, and there's so many little things I think that, especially reading the essays, that I wish people could be more empathetic about is like you talked about in your essays, like your handshake, right? Because of the medication you're on. And if I wasn't empathetic to that, I would be like, why is this? Is he nervous? Like, is he emotional right now? Why are his hand? Is he angry? Like, instead of reading into all those things, it's more quirks of your personality based on on bipolar and the medication you're on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like there's little things I think about often, like when you probably don't remember to see it. We were getting on a bus and you were like, you can sit here if you want. And like, to me, that was like, for you, that was like really stepping outside of your comfort zone to say like, hey, sit next to me. Like, like it's so like, I remember all those like little things. Cause like, I think they mean a lot once you understand like your specific personality traits because of your background. And then also what you've gone through on the mental health side.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for people to see through that because I think part of it was Susan Coyne's book about quiet, about introverts. I think really hopefully opened a lot of people's eyes to like a lot of people are different, introverted more than extroverted. And we live in a world where only extroversion is like appreciated or understood.
Yeah, I never read that book. I heard of that book. Yeah, as you know, I'm like a big introvert. So yeah.
So am I. So that's why, but especially American culture is set up for extroversion, right? And so most of the world doesn't understand if we're quiet and don't say anything. People then, to me, it's like a Rorschach block. They project all of their fears and emotions onto you, and then just think, the way to not feel any of those tough feelings, they just think you're a dickhead. So one of the things that you talked about that's after my own heart is you talk about the fact that you don't have kids a lot. And I've never been married, don't have kids. And I've always thought it's a superpower as an entrepreneur because I can just work 24/7. If I have an idea on a Friday or Saturday night at like midnight, I can work till 4 a.m. I don't have to worry about taking the kids to school. I don't have to worry about any of those things. But at the same time, when I talk to some friends of mine that are married and have kids, they say it helps them be much more time efficient. And I have a feeling like you're going to feel like that's bullshit.
No, I think that's true. I think it does help people be more efficient with their time, but I'm already pretty efficient with my time. I just work all the time. I just work all the freaking time, all the time. Like I'm always doing stuff. So yeah, I mean, when I got married when I was 23 and my wife and we made the decision back then that we weren't going to have kids. And we stuck to that. And she's professionally very successful in academics. And I've been professionally very successful. And if we had kids, one or both of us would have to sacrifice, probably both of us. And we were never willing to do that. So plus, like, I just don't like kids.
I like nice shit. So yeah,
I don't like the noise. I don't like the crying. I don't like I don't like voices. I don't like the smell of kids. I just don't like kids. So
what do you think when people always say, well, you just don't know until you have them and then you'd understand? Like, what's your internal response to that? Because I'm sure you're polite externally.
yeah, I mean, I never say anything, but like, and some people do have good kids. For example,
Yeah.
my brother-in-law has two good kids, but they're still kids and they still suck. Like they just, I.
But part of it, like, I think there was another essay you had, like, there's trade-offs for success, right? And so you can have more money, do more things, and enjoy your life in different ways than people with kids. And like you do produce a tremendous amount of work across multiple venues. And it's still shocking to me. Like you say, you work all day, still working all day. Your production is quite substantial. Like it really, truly is impressive. Like, so kind of like what's like a regular day for you? Like, how do you bifurcate your day to put out all that content, to do all the, like you said, by the way, what, Mazel Tov, what are you down to 51 days until you get your MFA? Something
Yeah,
like that?
51. Yeah.
Man, that's incredible. So yeah, walk me through like what's a typical day for Jared?
I don't get up super early. I get my sleep. I'm usually up around 6:30 and I'm in the office at 8. And I would say the first 4 hours of my day are pretty bananas because I'm sending out the newsletter and then I just get this wave of emails that I have to respond to. I have over 4,000 people on my list, so I get a lot of responses, have to reply to them. I also have a fair amount of admin work dealing with payments and the distribution list and stuff like that. And in the afternoon is what I schedule for things like this, for podcasts and reading and stuff like that. And then I usually go home around 3 or 4 and I have kind of an early dinner and then I sit on the couch and I write. Usually like that's what my time for other writing is at night. And I'll do that sitting on the couch until I go to bed. So from 6 o'clock until 10 o'clock is, I'm working on the couch. So.
Well, a couple questions there. Do you think, like you said, in the morning, go to the office, which is kind of surprising to me. Do you think you need an office for certain amounts of work, or like that you wouldn't be able to do at home? Like, you think you need the setting change?
Well, I used to think that, but I'm building a house and the new house is going to have like literally a separate building with an office. So I'm going to be working at home starting about 9 months from now, which is going to be really nice because I have a pretty long commute. And, I basically get an hour of my day back, which is going to be terrific. So.
And do you think part of that, though, you definitely need that cottage? Like you need that almost like sacred space where, when you go in there, you write or like this, or you work on Daily Dirtnap, or like it's very important or imperative to have it as a separate space in the, like outside the house?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's, I got cats, right? So if I'm working in the living room on the couch and the cats are all over me and it's just, there's a TV, there's a lot of distractions. So yeah, I definitely need my own space. Yeah.
But you write, like your MFA stuff at night though for hours, and you do that at home though?
Yeah, I do that at home. Yeah.
So do you think that's like a different creative headspace you need to be in to do that?
Yeah.
So that works for that?
Yeah, it works for that. Yeah.
When you were talking about earlier about, being distracted by an angry email or wanting to respond in an angry or pithy way, do you try to eliminate even looking at your phone or email for like the first half of the day, or how do you even structure that?
What's funny is I get busier and busier, and I have a pretty big Twitter presence. Like I don't really have time for Twitter anymore. Like it's, that used to be, I used to spend a lot of time on Twitter. I would tweet like maybe 10 or 20 times a day. I don't have time anymore. Like, I'll basically, I'll work until like 11 or noon and then I'll like scroll through Twitter and kind of get caught up. But like, I'm not living in that world like I was for so many years, so that's one thing that I kind of don't do anymore. So.
What do you think about, like, I personally hate it, but like the idea of these days of like everybody's talking about morning routines, right? And then you find these people who have like 50 things on their checklist and they got to go through a 2-hour morning routine. And to me, I'm like, they're like thinking that makes them optimal. And I'm like, it makes you fragile. Because if I get you out of your routine, you're going to think your day's wasted. Like, it's weird to me.
I actually, I don't like routine. I like doing different things every day. I travel a lot. I have to get on a plane at least once or twice a month. and go someplace. I'm actually flying to Vegas tomorrow with my nephew. So love to travel. And actually, I get a lot of work done while I'm traveling. Like 4 or 5 hour flight is like the best thing in the world. Like I can get a ton of writing done. So
yeah, I like, to your point, I love airports, I love airplanes, but sometimes at these conferences, I talked to you about this in Cayman, is like it's sometimes really detrimental to my mental health, the amount of like stimulus, and it kind of spins me up in kind of the manic states, like being at these conferences.
well, we were at that thing in the Caymans, and people were staying up all night, and I'm like, fuck that. Like like it gets to be like 10 o'clock, I'm going to bed, like I'm just not doing it. So
yeah, you're better about that than me. I get in that manic state and I just want to be part of everything. Luckily I don't drink hardly at all, so that helps. But otherwise, yeah, I just want to be part of the conversations, and you just get kind of caught up in the zeitgeist at the time. But there's two of my favorite essays I want to talk about. One, I love like a good metaphor. There's a writer, I can't remember his name, and that I apologize for that, but like it was actually a stand-up comedian, and he had this metaphor called "enjoy your burrito." I don't know if you ever heard of this one or remember this one.
No,
but
no.
He had moved to LA to become a stand-up comic, and the only place he could afford to live was way out in like Long Beach. And he was dirt poor. He's like living on a friend's couch, and the only thing he could afford was like this monstrous burrito, right? But he would have it at lunch every day, and it was at this great Mexican place, and he just loved this burrito, and that was the highlight of his day. But he found out like a third or a quarter or halfway through the burrito, he would start thinking about how miserable the next 24 hours were again until he got back to that burrito. And so he eventually had tattooed, I think, on his arm, "Enjoy your burrito," like enjoy the moment. And so I always love like a good phrase like that. And to me, yours was I shortened it to "play the tuba."
Yeah.
And I thought this was so brilliant. So like what is the metaphor of playing the tuba to like tell us what that means in general?
Okay, so I got to go back to marching band in high school.
Yeah.
And we got this new band director, and he's listening to the band. He's like, Jesus Christ, it sounds like a fucking kazoo band. It's like it just sounds all buzzy and reedy. And the thing was, like a lot of high school bands, you have a lot of flutes and clarinets and saxophones. And that's because they're the cheapest instruments. If a kid says he wants to learn how to play in a musical instrument, you generally don't go and spend $5,000 on a tuba. You'll spend like $400 on a clarinet. So high school bands generally have lots of flutes and clarinets and saxophones. So he made a rule that you could only have 8 flutes, 8 clarinets, and 8 saxophones in the band. And he had auditions, and anybody who didn't make the cut had to go learn another instrument, like a trombone, a baritone, or a tuba. So as a result, our band got instantly better because we had this big brass sound that other bands didn't have. It's big, low brass sound. But what was interesting was the kids that played the tuba got like full ride scholarships to schools to play the tuba, because if you're the University of Connecticut marching band, I mean, you need tuba players. Like they're really hard to find. So if there was one that was good, you would offer them a scholarship. And if you play the tuba, you can get a scholarship at anything in the country. So what I was talking about in that essay was this playing the tuba as a metaphor for doing something different that nobody else is doing, right? Like everybody goes into banking or tech because that's where the money is, but that's a meat grinder. People will make 500 grand a year for 10 years. And then it's like getting spit out the bottom of the porn industry, and they're like stuck. Like they just, they got to do something different. So, but if you do something different, I made up some hypothetical example, like making nozzles, right? Yeah. Like if you're like a nozzle manufacturer, you're the only one in the country. Like that is where people really, really succeed and make lots of money, when they're doing something different. So play the tuba.
And I think you even brought up is your brother brokers dental practices, right?
Yeah.
Like that those sort of things. By the way, you just remind me though, with comparing trading to porn stars, or I was actually thinking about earlier. It's actually similar to startups. I think I want to say is like Paul Graham says, people that do startups and succeed get they put 40 years of work into 4 years, so that's what they get paid for, and that's why everybody thinks it's a lot of money. But do you think it's almost similar to trading? Is like you're just getting, through that meat grinder, and that's why you get paid so much, because nobody can really work at that sustainable level for more than 5-10 years.
Yeah.
So the other one I was thinking of, why I love Play the Tuba so much, and I've even been putting it out on Twitter, because like I said, I love a shortened version, or that mnemonic to remember it, is like, do you know like Scott Adams, like one of one kind of idea?
Scott, what about Scott Adams?
Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, he has like this idea. I think he calls it like how to get to 101. Is like, you don't need to be the top 1% in anything. It's like, but if you're in the top 10% of 3 things that are fairly disparate, it makes you one of one, and nobody can compete with you. So instead of trying to be in the top 1% of anything, try to be in the top 10% of 2 to 3 things. And then that Venn diagram brings it down to 101. But you see how long it took me to express that, where I could just say, play the fucking tuba. That's why I love that was another essay I read to my girlfriend, by the way, just showing you like how like that I love little pithy things like that. Play the tuba is a great one. And by the way, that's the highest praise. I wouldn't doubt a decade from now I'm going to say to somebody, play the tuba, and they're going to be like, what are you talking about? It'll be my shorthand that I think about it. The other one that I really want to talk to you about is cargo shorts.
Oh yeah, white men can't dress.
So there's so many levels to this, because like you brought up earlier, like investment bankers in fleece vests. It was different back in the day, but that's how everybody kind of the Chad Laxbro and the fleece vest. But at the same time, cargo shorts are like your metaphor for how white men can't dress and how terrible it is. But what I think about though is like actually Devin Anderson and I were talking about this at dinner the other night, and you came up in our conversation, and I never like to talk about anybody behind their back, so we'll talk about it now. Is what I find interesting is like, you may not be wearing cargo shorts, but even as you write about and you wear proudly, is you have that like aged rocker aesthetic, right? You have like the cool rock shirts, the scarves, maybe some the bracelets, like the Johnny Depp, how many bracelets should I wear kind of thing. And I was telling Devin, like, you and I have very different aesthetics, but neither of us wear cargo shorts. So I'm just curious, like, how do you think about those? Like, almost beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or you might know this better, is like that phrase, there's no accounting for taste. The way I've always understood that phrase is like, there's no objective accounting for taste, but maybe it means something different. Maybe it means like people that don't have taste shouldn't be accounted for. Like, do you know what that means? Like, I don't know what the actual meaning of that phrase is.
I don't think that's the meaning of the phrase. Like, there's no accounting for taste. Like,
what do you think it means?
I think it just means like people just to have different tastes. I think that's what that means. So
yeah, that's what I was hopeful, but I didn't want it to be like some sort of like punching down kind of pejorative. But like, so why do you hate cargo shorts so much?
So it's not just cargo shorts, but like, so this all started. I took a trip to Vegas last year about this time. I was there during March Madness, so it was really crowded. And I'm looking around at the guys, and it's like ratty ass t-shirts and cargo shorts and flip flops, walking around with cans of Bud Light. And I'm like, all these people have money. I watched some guys wearing cargo shorts and t-shirts playing $500 a hand blackjack in flip flops. So I'm a little bit more traditional. Like, my favorite movie of all time is Ocean's 11. It's a perfect movie. It's just everything about it is perfect. And it's Devin's favorite movie too, right? So, but there's this scene in the beginning of the movie where George Clooney gets out of prison and he goes to the Trump Plaza in Atlantic City, and he's coming up the escalator, and he's wearing this houndstooth jacket and a brown shirt, and he looks amazing. And all the women are wearing dresses, all the guys are wearing jackets. I mean, Trump Plaza was never like that, but it's like that in the movie. And I just think that if you're wearing cargo shorts and t-shirts, you are telling people that you've given up and you don't care. Like, you just don't, like, you've totally given up. And I think, I've been married for 25 years. Like, I think you have some responsibility to be attractive to the opposite sex, even if you're married. Like, I don't want to be one of these people that gets married and puts on 100 pounds and starts wearing cargo shirts because I don't care anymore because I'm married. So I think you do have a duty to do these sorts of things.
It reminded me of, I just thought of it. There was an older, I think it was Sean Connery and Nick Cage film where there's like somebody takes over Alcatraz and they have like weapons that they're going to unleash on San Francisco, but like they get Sean Connery out of prison. And the first thing he says is like, I want a suit and a shave and a suite at the Fairmont. Like, you know, so it's like, once again, it's like going after that. And I don't think, I mean, I'm a weirdo, but my girlfriend's never even seen me wear jeans. But also in that essay where I'm 100% with you is, to me, is like, you shouldn't be wearing shorts or flip-flops unless there's a pool right next to you or an ocean 5 feet away. Yeah. That's the way I feel. Like whenever I see somebody walking around the city with flip-flops, I just want to stomp on their toes. Like nobody should have to see that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think about, you know, for a while, you know, I said I came up as a teenager, like working in fine dining establishments. So I developed this love for like food and wine and, you know, some of those great restaurants of the world. So I had to take some years off, you know, heads down, building our business and everything. But then my girlfriend and I had some time off. So we tried to go visit as many of like the world's top 50 restaurants as we could. And what was surprising over that like 5 to 10 year period of me kind of not visiting fine dining establishments is when I came back to like these top 50 restaurants or 3 Michelin starred, people were showing up in like sweatsuits to the restaurant, where when I grew up, it was like, you had to wear a suit. Like it was like, there's like respect and reverential ideas for like the chef and the team behind it and what they were producing. But it's like, that's completely dead and gone. And I wonder if that just makes me a dinosaur. And cause like, I wonder in a way, it's like kind of it runs parallel to me to what you were saying earlier about we becoming more civilized. Well, parallel to that, we might be becoming more casual. Like, how do you juxtapose those two?
I think that we're becoming more casual, but even it's like, I'm sure the people that you saw in those restaurants that were wearing sweatpants, I'm sure those were very expensive sweatpants.
Yeah, of course. They're like cashmere. Yeah. Bespoke. Yeah. Like tailored sweatpants.
Like they're not like Walmart, like $4 sweatpants. You know what I mean? I'm sure if they were wearing $4 sweatpants, the maitre d' would have asked them to leave. So I just think, like you say, oh my God, everybody's wearing sweatpants. Well, it's just, the standards just sort of change over time. It's kind of a moving target. You know what I mean? Like I was in, it was the rental car line at LAX. This was about a year and a half ago. It was the longest line of all time. It was terrible. But I looked around and there was like 8 different people in sweatpants. And I was like, you know, gosh, like, you know, what are we doing? But to be honest, like they were all like, not like they were like nice designer sweatpants, you know, like it didn't look trashy. If you want to see trashy sweatpants, come to Myrtle Beach. So.
But it reminds me though of like openness. What we were talking about earlier is like, I'm always afraid of falling into these perennial traps of like the old disparaging the young. Like I remember I was reading a book one time and it was about, you know, kids these days, the way they dress, the language they use, their haircuts, their irreverence, their what they're doing sexually at such a young age. The problem was that book was written in the 12th century in Japan. Like nothing could be more perennial, right? So how do we just not become too out of touch olds that are just shitting on the young?
Yeah, I know. And if you think about how old are you? I'm 49. You're
44.
44. So if you think about what older people were saying about us when we were kids.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we were named Generation X for a reason. Like we were like the bad kids. And we were bad. Like our generation like partied all the time, had sex, did drugs, like totally was anti-authority, rebellious. Like go back and watch some of those movies like Fast Times at Ridgemont High and stuff like that. Like
Kids is the craziest one too.
Yeah, that's what I think those are millennials technically, but
yeah, it might be around that edge. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah.
So part of it, seeing how technically we're both in finance and technically this is a finance podcast, we probably should talk about finance a little bit, or at least trading a little bit. One of the but kind of we get to there because I think your next book's about personal finance, right? That's what you're working on.
Yep. Yeah, it's actually done.
Oh, great. So, but part of what you were talking about is like how much you work, you know, maybe we need a little stress in our lives. Like, how do you feel about the FIRE movement of financially independent, retire early?
Oh my God. Yeah. This is awesome. Did you know you were going to like,
I just assumed, I assumed I was just like lighting the fuse and running away on that one.
So think about the whole philosophy behind the FIRE movement. the FIRE movement at its essence is about eliminating consumption, right? Like consumption is bad. You do not want to consume. So for the first 10, 15 years of your adult life, you're going to consume as little as possible and save as much as possible and get up to like $1 million or $2 million. And then for the next 50 years of your life, you're going to consume as little as possible to make this last, right? So you're living for 15 years in deprivation so that you can live for the next 50 years in deprivation. You're living your whole life in deprivation. Like, what? Whose idea is this? This is insane. It's totally insane. And not only that, you're miserable because pretend you're like 36 and you've been retired for a couple of years and you got 2 million in the S&P 500 index fund with Vanguard, right? Market goes down 3% in a day. You are shitting your pants, right? Because you're like, oh my God, I might have to go back to work. And I haven't worked in 3 years and my resume has a big gap in it. And you start freaking out. Anytime the market goes down, you're panicking. You know what I mean? And what are you doing with that time? Right? Like it's madness. So
how much do you think, like you're saying, is just like, I think about it as an affectation of like a 12-year bull market where then this thing gets popular because people think they can get rich off of their savings, right? And live off of them for the rest of their life. And it's more like mathematical fallacies and they don't even know how to deal with variance or volatility.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a mathematical fallacy if the return assumptions are correct. And the return assumptions were very generous. Right. Like people were doing this math based on like 12% return assumptions. And yeah, I mean, if the market goes up 12% a year for the next 50 years, like it'll work, but there's periods of time in history where the market goes down or sideways, from 1929 to 1946, 17 years, market return of zero. From 1969 to 1982, with a big bear market in 1974, market return of zero. Like, how do you survive something like that? So it just doesn't make any sense. It's path dependent, right? It's not just the 12% a year. It's all the drawdowns you'll take in between. There's a lot of path dependency.
Yeah, part of it, I think the ones that I've seen are successful, whether it's, the guy actually started Mr. Money Mustache or others, it's like, ironically, with what you do for a living, it's the ones that have hit this fire in their retirement, but then they go out and start another business, like they're newsletter writers, or they start like a vlog of what it's like to live in Portugal for expats, and they end up starting up an entrepreneurial business even while they're supposed to be retired. So like those are usually the only successful ones, right? That continue on. And I guess maybe there's something to be said for if they understandably hated their 9-to-5 so much that they then found a way out of that to regroup, think clearly, and then start their own business. But that's not FIRE, right? Then that's something totally different, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I had the same time, I was on a podcast yesterday that was with some financial advisors, and a lot of the podcast kept centering around answering me questions about retirement. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. What does that word even mean? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Not that I work incredibly hard or anything. It's just like the idea of retirement's kind of anathema. Like, I'm going to constantly, I optimize for curiosity. I'm not optimizing for wealth and to get to a number where then I can just lay down. Like, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, you and I are in a complete agreement on that for sure.
Except for you work a lot harder than I do.
I don't know about that. I think we just work at different times. You work in the middle of the night.
Exactly.
I go to bed.
One of the other random things that I really liked in one of the essays was like bet on winners and talk about a contrarian take. So like preternaturally, I feel like a lot of people think I'm contrarian. I'm not. Like, I'm pretty consensus. I just think at certain points I end up being contrarian, because if you're contrarian 100% of the time, you're going to end up nowhere. And so I think that was great part of your bet on winners essays is like, most of the time you probably want to bet on things continuing to win or conglomerates or large size to continue like inertia. Do you think it's more of an inertia effects, or how do you think about managing your ability to be contrarian in like maybe punctuated contrarianism?
I mean, this is almost what Soros was talking about with reflexivity, right? It's like very similar. The winners usually keep winning. The losers usually keep losing. One thing I find interesting about the stock market is that everybody loves to bet on a turnaround, and I do this sometimes too. Like, I fall into this trap. Like, you see a stock that's down 80% and you're like, it's going to come back. And No, the reality is that losers usually keep on losing. Like that's it. Like they're trends. I mean, somebody who's a technical analyst would say that this is a trend. So,
well, my favorite part of that is like non-ergodic path dependency. Like, what do you call a stock that goes from down 80% to down 90%? It means when you got in at 80, you're down 50. But
yeah,
people don't tend to think about it that way. They're looking at the total chart, not their own individual sequence or kind of path dependency.
yeah.
But related to winners keep on winning, or maybe some sort of inertia on that, is you brought it up at the beginning, is the sentiment around US dollar right now. I find this fascinating. Like, as you know, like as both of us like try to have a lot of historical perspectives, like during the Cold War, the 50s to 70s, everybody thought it was the end of dollar hegemony as well. But like I'm not surprised that this is coming back up, but like surprised why it's coming up now. And I don't think people really even understand the tentacles that the dollar has like around the world. And I'm just curious from a sentiment perspective, like what you think about it.
Well, I mean, you said a lot of what I think about it. This comes around about every 10 years or so. You can go back and look at the Economist covers of, for the end of the dollar. Like this has happened about every 10 years, they run a cover on that. And I think the reasons people are thinking that are totally rational. After Russia invaded Ukraine, we basically locked Russia out of the global financial system. We cut them off from SWIFT and they didn't have access to dollars. And so they're looking for an alternative. And other countries have seen what's happened to Russia, and they're just sort of, thinking out loud. I mean, even Macron is saying this, like, gosh, like maybe we shouldn't be so dependent on the dollar, because what if the US decides to cut us out of the system? So I think it's totally rational that it's coming up now. Did you see my Daily Dirtnap piece the other day about the Navy?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, like, my take is basically the way a country projects its power globally is through its Navy, right? So we have the strongest Navy in the world. Basically, World War II was a naval war in the Pacific. We won through the Navy. We haven't had a naval war in 80 years, but before the US, it was Great Britain who had the biggest Navy in the world for 200 years. And they also had the world's reserve currency. Before Great Britain, it was Spain. So until we lose a naval war, like we're going to have the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, I think there's so many things in that, like, we are the only like true blue ocean Navy, as you would say in that. And I think, but it's a good heuristic for people to go, until we lose a major naval war, then we can talk about the decline of the dollar. Otherwise, we're kind of wasting our time. But I think it's even more complex or nuanced than that. It's not only do we have that blue ocean Navy, we haven't lost a Navy war. As you know, over 90% of the trade is across the oceans, and we provided that service for decades now for almost most of the countries of the world. But I think it's also combining with other Peter Zeihan ideas of like the U.S. has a really unique ability to grow its own food that also is helps prop up that dollar. Like you said, militarily, we prop up the dollar, but also we have soft power, right? Like all of our media that gets disseminated around the world, like everybody still wants to be Americans. It just has like such of these like winner take all effects kind of across the board. And like you said, and then whether oil or whatever else is denominated in dollars, I just don't think people realize like how it's almost like this is water, right? That's the dollar. It's like it's so much part of everyday life around the world that people don't realize this is the water that we all swim in.
Yeah, that was very well said. I can't improve on that. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't even know what I said. I blacked out there. But so I think this is maybe, I remember what it was. Sentiment. This is interesting because you always call yourself a sentiment trader. The things you write about are sentiment. And by the way, I loved your stuff on CRA, on commercial real estate. So I used to be a commercial real estate developer in Charleston. I've talked to Corey Hofstein about this so many times. Like I've been around real estate my whole life. If there's anything I know, I cannot call the demise or boom in real estate. Like I don't really understand how the world works, but I loved yours is like we're at peak CRE sentiment as far as like as CRE going to collapse. And I just love that because, like you said, you saw it was it Vox or like one of those channels was like talking about that CRE is about to collapse because of the regional banks and et cetera. And I think that's an interesting perspective is like, where is the peak sentiment and where are you seeing it almost on the streets or like at the barbershop in Myrtle Beach? And that tells you that like the worst is over.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I wonder, related to that, I think the last time we were together, I wonder, as I said, like maybe we get calmer as we get older because we're losing testosterone. But the other part I think I brought up with you last time we were together is like, if you think about like Buffett or Howard Marks or some of the things you say, and you've said some of these great ones on Dimitri Kofinas' like Hidden Forces as well. And Dimitri and I have talked about this. Is like, do you think as we get older and we see the markets more and the world more, it's you go back to like these really simple, pithy things, like, right, of like sentiment. And it's hard to trade off a sentiment, but the world really revolves in very simplistic ways, and it waxes and wanes kind of on sentiment. But I wonder, I fear when, because I'm getting more and more into your camp, is like, do you feel like sometimes though, like you're a simpleton? Like people want like, no, tell me what to trade. Tell me what the big news is. Tell me like how to do this. And you're like, it rises and falls and reverts and comes back, or it trends. Like, it's like, you just really say simple things because that's what the world is. It's at a high level, it's pretty simple sometimes, but like, but it makes the trajectory versus timing debate is always difficult.
Yeah.
So I think this is maybe a good place for us to wrap up. So I want you to plug away again. Where can people find you? Where can they find the book? Plug away, please.
Well, if you're still listening. The book is Those Bastards, 69 Essays on Life, Creativity, and Meaning. You can find it on Amazon. It's selling pretty well, and the reviews are pretty good. I did get 1 star. I got one star review on Amazon, and which is, if you're an author, that's inevitable, like whatever.
It also makes it real, right? If you had all 5 stars, maybe nobody would believe it.
Yeah.
You got to throw that ringer in there.
And if you want to subscribe to the newsletter, it's dailydirtnap.com. There's a subscribe button. You just hit that button. You can send me an email and I'll hook you up. So
yeah. So as you would say, I recommend everybody run out, buy 10 copies of Those Bastards, sign up for the newsletter. You'll obviously get some great writing in there. You get some pithy one-liners that are always great. As Devin was saying too, I think he said you have like 50 different ways to say jerking off that you can ramble through. That was a good way of looking at it. Oh, one last question I forgot to ask you. Have you read Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck?
I haven't actually.
Oh, because I was wondering, like, to me, it's like, it's interesting, like, you're, not to say they're similar because comparison is a thief of joy, but it's like just realistic, not advice, but it is advice of just like how life works and talking to people like they're people instead of giving them Hallmark cards, and how effective that is. I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I haven't read the book. Maybe I should now. One of my blurbs, actually, one of my reviews actually compared it to that book. But no, I haven't read it.
But it's once again, it's just talking to people like they're people. And by the way, your other blurb that was awesome from Turney Duff was the best advice you never asked for. So Jared, thanks for coming on the pod. I appreciate it. Everybody run out and buy the book.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, we'd appreciate it if you would share this show with friends and leave us a review on iTunes, as it helps more listeners find the show and join our amazing community. To those of you who already shared or left a review, thank you very sincerely. It does mean a lot to us. If you'd like more information about Mutiny Fund, you can go to mutinyfund.com. For any thoughts on how we can improve the show or questions about anything we've talked about here on the podcast today, drop us a message via email. I'm Taylor@mutinyfund.com and Jason is Jason@mutinyfund.com, or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at Taylor Pearson ME and Jason is at Jason Mutiny. To hear about new episodes or get our monthly newsletter with reading recommendations, sign up at mutinyfund.com/newsletter.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Mutiny Fund, their affiliates, or companies featured. Due to industry regulations, participants on this podcast are instructed to not make specific trade recommendations nor reference past or potential profits. Listeners are reminded that managed futures, commodity trading, forex trading, and other alternative investments are complex and carry a risk of substantial losses. As such, they're not suitable for all investors, and you should not rely on any of the information as a substitute for the exercise of your own skill and judgment in making a decision on the appropriateness of such investments. Visit mutinyfund.com/disclaimer for more information.